Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 21st edition of the Disruptive Fridays. This edition started in the beginning of the lockdown in April 2020, and in the meantime developed as our online program series. Since October 2020, it is also funded by the European Cultural Foundation, which actually helps us keeping it going. Today, I would like to thank Elizabeth Glauser from the Boiling Head Media for the production of this edition and the great support from the whole Disruption Network Lab team that I have in the background. Before we go into details, I would like to ask you to actively join the chat on our website and ask questions, as we will pick them up in the last part of our talk. And we are really always curious to hear the interaction with you. So today's topic is something that, it's very unusual in our talks regionally. We will talk about the legacy of resistance, rediscovering Yugoslavia's partisan history. With me in the studio, in the virtual studio, I have Marta Popivoda, a researcher and filmmaker from Serbia, originally, but based in Germany at the moment, and Gal Kirn, cultural and political theorist from Slovenia, but also based in Germany. So hello, Marta and Gal, and I'm really, really happy to have you both here with me today to discuss on this topic. So as a small introduction, as we announced it also in the program, today we will talk about the so-called Yugoslav Socialist project, something that started in the 1945 after the end of the Second World War and officially existed until the beginning of the 90s. Or this is in a way the ideology behind creating the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, which, looking back from our point in time, seems like a unique visionary experiment and project that actually happened until a certain point in time. So built on the partisan struggle and legacy, it is characterized by a progressive thought and aimed at creating new political institutions, equal gender representation, massive modernization and functional infrastructure. But also it introduced new forms of ownership and practiced workers' self-management. So this is the reason why to us today it is really fascinating, like the generation that experienced only the dawn of these days, basically, and these ideas. But yet the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia broke into 7 different countries after the nationalist bloodshed in the 90s. So after the break of the state, much of this legacy was wiped out by the historical revisionism that followed in each of the independent countries with different dynamics. So transitioning to various narrow-minded nationalist narratives. So what brings us to this today is basically that underneath this blanket, there is still a shared memory and culture and knowledge built on this legacy that still pertains and thrives among both the older and the younger generation long after the fall of this country. So nowadays, this legacy serves as an anchor for a progressive political identity, rather and shared values of solidarity, of anti-fascism, and this idea of internationalism. So basically the guests that I have today with me, Marta Popivoda and Gal Kirn, are some of the researchers who really go deeper into the past and embody different temporal and political notions of the Yugoslav past, but also what we will focus on today, the partisan ideology. And how this whole this past then affected the building of this all these systems that we mentioned before. So in this edition, we will discuss their work as a starting point, and then through their work and reflections, we will discuss the possibilities to translate this and transform the past and counter the political polarization and growing fascism of today. but not only that. So as a first speaker today, I would like to invite Gal Kirn, as someone who is observing this phenomenon from a cultural, political, and theoretical stance, to give us a little introduction into his work and place us first in the context. Gal is really experienced cultural and political theorist. He also holds a PhD in political philosophy with focus on socialist Yugoslavia and philosophy of Louis Althusser. And then he continues to his research from Jan van Eyck Academy to postdoctoral fellow at the Humboldt University to currently being a postdoctoral visiting fellow at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry, Berlin. So I would like to give we will also refer to the latest book by Gal, but maybe later in the second part. So first, I would like to give the floor to Gal to share your experience with us. And later on, we will discuss more. That's all from me for now. Microphone, please.
Yeah. Hello. So thank you, Elena, for organizing, putting this together. Thanks everyone who could join us in our virtual meeting. So let me jump straight into the discussion of this context where, kind of critical research or kind of critical triangulation between the politics, theory, and art is located, or from where also with Marta and with a lot of other friends and comrades we intervene into. So, as you know, we have full hands of work. As you can imagine, the Berlin Wall for some was a very festive event, and the fall of socialism for some in the former East, while for Yugoslavia it meant wars. It means the democratic transition to democratic political parties, to the liberal democracy was actually happening and bringing people to war. So new political parties were parties of war. So this is like first important point to kind of also challenge a certain discourse on transition that says we are going towards transnationalism, towards Europe, towards open society, free market, political society. That is, in Yugoslavia, it was a kind of reversed process. So from transnationalist federalist idea, you come to what you mentioned, 7 different countries, and the process is not even over yet. So that is one kind of mobilization of populations into ethnic wars, which brings a strong retraditionalization of society, where different minority groups, but also women and stuff are heavy toll, pay heavy price. So. That's one part of it. And much of theoretical discussion was then divided onto 2 strands. Kind of these post-social studies addressed, let's say, on one side, critique of excess of state, critique of excess of ideology. So they were criticizing nationalism, defending human rights, and so on. So kind of what I would call more left liberal perspective in the context. And then on the other side, you would have more critique of political economy. So people that remained Marxian, Marxist, and criticized, let's say, gradual, or at some places more abrupt demontage of the welfare state, and a kind of coming of neoliberalism. So my kind of proposal or proposition that I also took in some of my articles or books is to connect these strands together. So not to be saying that there is a certain primacy in criticizing of nationalism or of state ideology, and not only seeing history as a movement of capital, as if there is no subjectivity, as if there is no possible resistance, emancipation, even putting socialism as experiment in the bracket, it was only state capitalism. So if it was only state capitalism, that nothing really changed after 89, 91, right? But much things changed. So this is kind of my starting point where I criticize certain, let's say, world system perspective that was quite important also in our context. But as well, not just to focus on the cultural phenomena, so the everyday life in post-socialism and socialism. You have a lot of anthropology, historians doing work, and also talking about Yugo nostalgia and so on. We will come to that in a little bit. So for me, one of the key concepts to understand transition is Marxian concept of primitive accumulation of capital. So that shows that when there is certain transition, either in neoliberalism, within capitalism, or from socialism to capitalism, you will have a strong investment of ideological apparatuses of state, and you will have a big degree of violence, right? So it's not just economical work, but also other. And this is what I kind of call then primitive accumulation of memory by the state. So in the moment where the society was supposed to be empowered and free of the communist terrible past, we were supposed to see the future and open society. Actually, society was already sold out. So kind of this social ownership or the means of production, the social capital, so to speak, that was accumulated in times of socialism was being privatized, was being, in case of Yugoslavia, it was not in the state hands, but it was in social hands. So in a sense, we had different wave of socialism called, what you said, worker self-management, which meant that workers had something to say about the process of valorization. It wasn't just the state that would put the prices or factories, but there was a very complex system of discussions and of, let's say, dividing the value or distributing it, participating in it. So in the moment where we have like the strongest dispossession economically, so there is much more class inequalities, more people get unemployed, a lot of people brain drain after the 90s. There is a constant movement of young people abroad. We have the strongest nationalistic renovation, but it doesn't speculate with future, but it speculates with past. In case of Slovenia, with Carantinians, Carantania. In case of Macedonia, as you know well, as Alexander the Great. So the most wild speculation with the past in the moment where the future is being sold. Right? So that's this contradictory tension that is at place in this transition, and also importantly for Germany or the German context where we find ourselves now, and the early post-Yugoslav context, we were maybe joking a lot about a Trump project, MAGA, Make America Great Again. But what is the reunification of Germany but Make Germany Great Again? And we had all a heavy dose of Make Slovenia Great Again, Make Serbia Great Again, all these particular petty countries that have been reinvented or have been reinventing traditions and a lot of times also mythologies, but mythologies that had very strong ideological force. So that mobilized a lot of people, and that were started not by some, as they say, rural, backward countryside, no, by intellectuals. So there is a very strong legacy of heavy, excessive nationalism within the most established and academic institutions in Europe, not just like to say it's in Yugoslav context. But yeah, this is one of the things, and if we look at it globally, as Manuela Boacha or some people in the more decolonial perspective would be saying, the former East, so not just Yugoslavia, but former East and Latin America through 80s, 90s, become the hotspots of the neoliberal experiments, so neoliberal reforms. So this is something that when we talk about the constellation of the authoritarian neoliberalism today, to have a little bit longer perspective and why we research Yugoslavia or this post-Yugoslavia. So now to take a step back from the context to put it in the perspective, why should we talk about the partisan past or Yugoslav past? Of course, I must say that I come from the space which was relatively lucky. So this is Slovenia, which didn't have really war, but of course it felt the consequences of the transition and of the wars, like the first experiences with this methodological craziness of nation is to that the history teachers were insisting in always in any historical period also say, so what did Slovenia do 2000 years before Christ? What did Slovenia do? Like, so there is a certain kind of line that was inscribed in the curricula, in academic school curricula. And for our discussion today, kind of this investment with the memory, right? I would say that there are three major responses that were there. In Slovenian context, national reconciliation, which sounds fancy and very nice, but if you look at it a bit closer, it means reconciling partisans, anti-fascist with fascist from the Second World War. Second World War was this important point that we call kind of dissonant heritage or disputed memory, in which kind of divided Slovenian nation or Serbian or Croatian. We all had not just fight against fascism as a German, Italian, or whatever was the occupation force, but also the fight against the local fascist collaborators, whether they are home guards, Chetniks, Ustasha, and so on. So this is the important part. The national reconciliation, in order to move to certain future of the nation, we have to reconcile these parts together. And for this reason, there are new monuments, there's new museums, there is a whole kind of cultural or memory apparatus that came in place. Second, this is more coming from the right wing, it's like open rehabilitation of fascism. So you would see monuments, you would see different commemorative practices that would be cherishing the local fascists. Then thirdly, Yugo-nostalgia. So Yugo-nostalgia is something that would be, participating in some kind of commodification of memory of certain past and kind of also freezing the past in certain paradise that didn't exist. So for me or for my research, I wrote 2 books. I was for a couple of years working with this project. I think it's time to move on, but just like to tell you that I try to kind of grasp this Yugoslav project beyond this kind of Manichaean divide. On one side, this demonization, everything was bad, and on the other side, everything was good. So when we talk about, let's say, rise and demise of socialist Yugoslavia, I started with the concept of partisan rupture. So what is the partisan rupture? It doesn't relate only to the victory of anti-fascist and partisan Titoists in the Second World War, but also start of certain kind of emancipatory, deeper social transformation, which, as you said, it's not just gender representation, but it was like really cultural empowerment of like 2 million anti-fascist women participating in the struggle. It was huge. It was huge. It was also cultural struggle in a sense that this we can talk a little bit later. There was 40,000 poems and songs written by mostly anonymous partisans. So there is this kind of very strong cultural, political, and also military struggle that is kind of opening the trajectory to a very different Yugoslavia that is not based anymore on the kingdom and kind of this Yugoslav melting pot that all tribes will come together. But there is, of course, this equality of nations, and there is a new subject that comes, is like working people. So kind of working people, these are all the, so to speak, the dispossessed. So you have workers, peasants, and women and youth, which is a kind of the broadest coalition that was also participating and winning the war. In this sense, Yugoslav case is specific because a part of, like, let's say, Greece, Albania, to some degree, it was the only place where they really could liberate mostly on their own social forces, so without big help of the Western or Eastern allies. This political autonomy that I would also claim is the base for understanding two other ruptures. So if you have partisan struggle, then you have second rupture, which is like coming after the split with Stalin in 1948. So you have orientation inside towards worker self-management, which is a different type of socialism. And on the other side, globally, going away from the Balkans as the only kind of referential point of the Balkan communists, so to speak, into co-creating anti-colonial state movement, so non-aligned movement, and with a lot of different countries. And this was basically also on the major geopolitical level, criticizing the bipolar or this Cold War constitution of the world. So all those that speak about 45 and 89 as some kind of Cold War imaginary actually fail to recognize that there has always been the third way, not just in socialism, but also in the sense having a much more affirmative stance towards third world, not just as some kind of economic category, but as a political project. Think about Vijay Prashad and different also tricontinental imaginary. So this is one thing. The second thing, maybe the more ambivalent or critical, if I have 2 minutes time, probably. No. So it's basically just some kind of, yeah, we are over. Okay. So
yeah, but just wrap up your thought. We will continue later. Will be good to just, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no problem. So you have this emancipatory core, but I also say it doesn't end in the 80s, 90s with war. It didn't just happen like out of the thin air. But there are contradictions in the self-management model in this reform that I analyze a lot, the market reform, which kind of empower capitalist element within socialism, and the kind of logic of decentralization that already empower nationalist ideology and empowers the republic against the federation. So this is basically my kind of core investment. And then maybe for discussion, we talk about the second approach of this counter-archive.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry for interrupting you, but just for the sake of time, this is unfortunately a very short series. I will now skip my question because you touched a little bit upon it and introduce Marta. And then maybe we just open it up at the end of her presentation. I think that would be now the most reasonable thing to do. So just, the second speaker, Marta Popivoda, she's a filmmaker, author, and researcher. And her work on the other side, explores tensions between memory and history, collective and individual bodies, but also the ideology and everyday life, with a focus really on anti-fascist and feminist potentialities of the Yugoslav Socialist project. Her future documentary Yugoslavia, how ideology moved our collective body was really screened in many international film festivals. But today also we have something that is much more recent, her new feature documentary, Landscape of Resistance, and something that we will also enter into our discussion later. So now I would just like to invite you, Marta, to give us a little bit of introduction and introduce us to your work. And then later, I think we will have a very interesting discussion among the two of you.
Thank you, Elena. And I could listen to Gal forever. I'm really sorry in a way that he stopped. You said already a bit about, my work. What are the main focuses or interests of my work or concerns in my work? Definitely this tension between memory and history, which also relates to Gal's work. Recently, I listened to his talk at one conference where he talks about Marxist memory, and I really want to expand on that in a private setting. But yes, maybe I would say also that I very much cherish collective practice in art making and research, and I have been a part of a Walking Theory collective from Belgrade for about 15 years. Finally, at the end, we are like spread around the world, and this collective practice is not that possible anymore. But I mention this because what is specific for my work and which originates from Walking Theory Collective is that I usually make my films and video installations and other works within long-term artistic and theoretical research projects. My first feature documentary, which you already mentioned, Yugoslavia, How Ideology Moved Our Collective Body, was also made within one of these research projects called Performance and the Public. And actually, I did it together, I mean, not the film, but the research with two of my colleagues from Walking Theory, Veljanovska, were artist in residence in one cultural center in Paris dedicated to artistic research. I mean, back then in 2010, actually, we started investigating this topic. And two of them wrote a book called Public Sphere by Performance, which was published by B Books in Berlin. And I made this film in collaboration with Anna, who is actually my my closest collaborator as a dramaturg and co-writer of both of my feature films, Yugoslavia, How Ideology Moved Our Collective Body, and the new one, Landscapes of Resistance. So if you see that in the title of the film there is Yugoslavia. So the film is in many ways about Yugoslavia, but more specifically, the film deals with the question of how ideology of that country performed itself in public space through mass performances. And actually, what I did during the research and in the film is that I collected and analyzed film and video, media footage from the period of 1945 till 2000s, where we didn't have, socialist Yugoslavia anymore, but Milosevic Yugoslavia. So it starts with the beginning of the socialist Yugoslavia after the Second World War and ends with the overturn of Milosevic when actually the name of Yugoslavia, which was back then in 2000 was consisting only from Serbia and Montenegro, was actually dissolving. So my focus in the film were state performances, and here I would name few like youth work actions or May Day parades or celebrations of the Youth Day, which were done with a huge mass performances in the stadiums, in the public space, but as well counter demonstrations like 68 movement in Yugoslavia, then student and civic demonstrations in the 90s, and the so-called 5th October revolution or overturn of the Milosevic regime. And actually, maybe we could say that going back through the images, the film traces how communist ideology was gradually exhausted through the changing relations between the people, ideology, and the state of in the case of Yugoslavia, of course. Film is done in a form of essay film, so it's a very also personal perspective on history of Yugoslavia. It's not about everything that happened in Yugoslavia, so there is a very specific perspective also from Belgrade, because two of us who wrote the film are coming from Belgrade, so we tried also to define this perspective not as universal, but as coming from this specific point of view. And yes, definitely what is important about this film is that it was made in 2013 when I would say not so many artists were dealing with the heritage of socialist Yugoslavia. I mean, not so many as today. I think today there is more people dealing with this. And I would say especially in Serbia, because I think there was a lot of, there was a tabooization of socialist ideas in the public sphere in Serbia, let's say, because I know this context the best. Of course, because of the Milosevic politics and his proclaiming himself a socialist while he was actually a nationalist leader. And I would also maybe mention that for this film, it's important, especially when I talk about this film in the international context. I mean, Gal already mentioned a bit of it, but it's important to know that the Yugoslavia was, third wave socialism. So it was not part of the Eastern or the Western Bloc. That it proposed a non-aligned movement as something, as a solidarity project of non-aligned countries. So. For me, it's always important to stress this, because I think when you watch the film, you need to know this specific context, I would say. Yes, what was maybe also, theoretically interesting, because this is, not a cinematic context, so to speak, about cinematic devices that we used in the film, but actually during the research project, we had two main concepts that we were dealing with from different perspectives, theoretical and artistic perspective, and these were a concept of social choreography by Marxist sociologist Andrew Hewitt, and concept of social drama by anthropologist Victor Turner. And I, as an artist, as a filmmaker, I try to translate these two concepts into the moving images. So I decided to deal with social choreographies like of socialist Yugoslavia. First, of course, I need to say what it is. And I would say that social choreography is a concept that describes how actually every dominant ideology, even capitalism, which tries to say it's not an ideology, influences how we relate to each other in public space. So how our bodies relate to each other and how we relate to architecture and other elements present in the public space. So I would say this is social choreography. And in the film, I try to follow the dominant ideology of Yugoslavia through editing sequences of these mass performances. And then we have social drama as these moments in society when change is possible, and these liminal moments when there is a possibility for change, but maybe, change will not happen. And in this case, in the case of this film, we have a 68 movement in Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia as a first social drama in the film, where definitely we had this possibility of change, and some things changed definitely, but then we see also with the Tito speech and to the students that actually the dominant ideology stays the same, even some things in the system were changed. And then we have definitely death of Tito as a new social drama in Yugoslavia, and maybe most significant social drama in this film would be Milosevic's speech at Gazimestan, which is considered as a kind of starting point or initiation of or anticipation of the future civil war. In a way, in the film, I actually start a film with the Tito speech after the Second World War, where he talks about solidarity and unification of all these nations which were part of this supranational state, and the film in the 5th October Revolution and overturn of Milosevic, but also with this speech of Milosevic at the Gazimestan, which is very significant, not because it's unique in the territory of Yugoslavia, like other leaders also had similar speeches, but because also for me visually, it was, I mean, I'm speaking from my own context from Serbia, so I'm critical towards what was happening there. But in the same time, we see exhaustion and the disappearance of the socialist collective body and emergence of nationalist collective body in this event at Gazimestan. We need to close this discussion, but I would just like to come to the new film, because new film is different in many ways, but also complementary to the first one. In the first one, I had this macro perspective. I was dealing with also state ideology and how this actually communist ideology after the Second World War got institutionalized and then also exhausted in this very extended period. While in the new film, I would say that it deals with the earlier stage of embodiment of the communist and anti-fascist ideology through the story of a woman who was actually one of the first partisan women in Yugoslavia, and as a political prisoner, she ended up in Auschwitz, and there she was also, she joined self-organized resistance movement there and was the leader of its combat unit. Here I would connect to the topic of course, our talk today and discussion, that for me this story was very powerful in many ways, but something that was there from the beginning, and why I considered why I wanted to make this film and work on it over 10 years was because I thought in her story there is a strong sense that an idea and emotion as well, or affect, that resistance is always possible. So this was something that I wanted to evoke in the audience in this specific moment when the film is coming out, because I think with the rise of right-wing politics and new fascisms in Europe and much wider, we need this inspiration and idea that resistance is always possible.
So thank you, Marta and Gal. Sorry for me from jumping in the background, but I also would like to ask you something, and we have questions already arriving from the audience, and the time is really getting short. So I will give one snappy question to both of you, so I can also read you out the interesting questions that we are getting from the audience. So Marta, one thing maybe I want to ask you to reflect on. Your movie was simply just started being shown on festivals. So what is the feedback that you're receiving, and how does that basically reflect resonate with the people today? And I would basically have the same question after that for you, Gal, about your recent publication, because this is also very known to us who come from the region, but also presenting in a different context. I'm interested about the resonation of your work.
I must say that both Anna and I were very surprised how people connected with this story and with the film, and how they found it very relevant for this specific moment. Also in the film, there is, Sonia's story, which is very powerful in many ways. Also, she's very powerful storyteller. But then there is also another layer in the film that I think, audience found very important, and this is a kind of written working diary of Anna and me, where we actually try to reflect, of course, on why we are making this film, and also in a way, through this layer in the film, people can understand who and why is making this film, that it's two women, that we are leftist activists from Belgrade who moved to Germany, that we are a couple as well, like a queer couple. And I think really people connected also with this layer in the film, and it was a bridge to I would say contemporary audiences, because for me, I must say this is not a historical film. It's a film in all of my work. There is this Benjaminian tigers who leap into the future. So it's the history that we want to invest in our future. It's not like that history that we are investigating and some kind of objective researchers. It's always investment in the into the future, and reflection and confrontation with the contemporary moment.
Thank you. And Gal, your latest book is The Partisan Counter Archive, retracing the ruptures of art and memory in the Yugoslav people's liberation struggle. So, yeah, I would like to also, you're going into very interesting documentary, like part of the artistic heritage. Some things that I could just see myself were really, amazing. So I really would like to ask you how do you, to reflect a bit on your recent book, but also what is the response you're getting, also when you're presenting it or discussing about this past today. Microphone, please.
It resonates very, very strongly with Marta and Anna's work, but also like with couple of others that have been invested in, let's say, bringing something out of academic curiosity into some kind of body that has been dismembered and has been put to new life. So this afterlife of socialism, afterlife of partisan struggle, how it's important for us today. So this is like a certain methodology that is very much invested in kind of Benjaminian project to read history as a history of ruptures, disruption, if you want, also as Disruptive Friday and labs, and not as some kind of teleology of the end of history or linear or national history that has its own episodic periods. These episodes that we call also like ruptures have changed the social constellation in a sense, not forever, because the rupture is not eternal, but one has to draw consequences out of it. So in this sense, partisan from yesterday becomes our contemporary. This is also like when John Akramfah says at the end of Handsworth Songs, where he talks about the riots and different solidarities between the dead and the living. So kind of taking even this kind of concern of Benjamin that even the dead are not safe in front of fascism, basically making our allies. So as my kind of major intervention in the memory studies, or what we can still read as a kind of predominant epistemological foundation of memory model, also in Europe, commemoration of violence. So you have a very strong also commemorative day in European Union of communist violence, fascist violence, what we call totalitarian violence, right, which kind of flattens out of history. And all this commemoration of violence then ignores colonial violence. So there is not one mention of colonial violence inside of official memory politics, inside of official museum in Brussels, inside of pan-European monuments and so on. So that's this kind of rereading of history is quite of course, narrow mind, not just narrow and nationalist minded, but also like focused on these violent procedures. While I think that, and this is where we share our kind of reading of the past, is like to talk about emancipation. So to kind of, there is this move from memory of violence to memory of emancipation, which is like much more marginalized inside of the memory studies, which are, there is this link between victims of perpetrators and violence model, while emancipation, of course, already brings a completely different protagonist. So protagonists are the oppressed, the dispossessed, right? So it's not anymore the ethnical victim, but it's something that has to do with the complex historical reality. So in this sense, my criticism of memory studies is on the one side of the model of violence. It's not that we should stop commemorating violence, but if we are to build some kind of transnational solidarity, emancipation is a much more viable and potent strategy. So this is my kind of criticism in general. So for now, it's quite well accepted, but of course, it's been published at the end of the summer last year, and because of the corona and pandemics, I do mostly virtual presentations so far. So the first symposium that we wanted to have in live is also where Marta will be at the end of April at the ICI Berlin, but it will be also online. Mm-hmm. So it will have to the bigger meeting with the public will have to wait a bit, but it has got already a couple of nice, at least comments and stuff, what has to be said as well. If you compare book and film, book and the work of theory is very difficult to measure. It doesn't have the immediate response of the audiences and let's say immediate reviews and stuff, but it can get contemporary in 5-10 years. Maybe somebody from completely different context will use it at some point. Yeah. And in this sense, as a critical theorist, I think it's important, dissemination, but then you have to activate yourself, not just as academic, but to use your critical knowledge in politics, in artistic practices, and so on. So to be a bit flexible with the intellectual capacities.
Thank you. I mean, I would like to grab 2 questions from the audience and then maybe ask one that I also like to hear the answer to for the end. And then at the end, we will show Marta's trailer, because we somehow, didn't show it while you were talking, but I thought now that maybe we keep it for the end. So I have one question for the audience for Marta. One is, where can we see, if at all at the moment, watch your film? But also, what was the most surprising thing you learned from Sonia? She looks like a tremendous woman. Microphone?
Second question first, answer to the second question first. What we learned from Sonia, definitely then, that you don't need to be a hero in order to be a partisan, and that we need to be partisans today, and at the end of the film, we say also that this is in a way a partisan film. Maybe it sounds, weird to say this, but for me it means, to make a political film which actually intervenes into dominant discourses in the public sphere and introduce a new perspective to things. Our film also has a very specific female perspective, or what Svetlana Alexievich would call a womanly side of the war. So we are talking about something, not just I mean, we are not talking really about history, because this history didn't, we are talking about memory, because actually we are hearing stories from her which never entered dominant historical narratives. It's also, about this female perspective, which is anti-heroic, which always stresses that she was part of a collective, of a self-organized partisan collective, that solidarity, care, and resistance were main principles. And that's why, it is a story of one person and one body, but in a way, in the film, she really refers and mentions all the time how she was part of a collective body. And this is also what we need to understand today, that we are part of a collective body, that we are not kako se kaže nemoćan? Sorry. Nemoć.
Oh gosh, not powerful.
Yeah, that we are powerful as part of a collective. And I would say also that actually it's possible to see the film now soon. We have a German premiere at Go East Festival, and also Berlin premiere at the ICI conference that Gal organizes. Actually end of the month, there will be possibility to see the film over a couple of days in Germany.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. So I have one question to Gal now, also from the audience. It is usually written that the rise of nationalism in Yugoslavia in the 80s developed after the economical and political crisis. Could you explain more how this process happened, and what was the role of the crisis back then in strengthening nationalism? It's a big question, but also important.
Let me try my luck with answering of this amazing question. I would say that one has to start then in 60s, 70s to make it even more complicated. But what I try to sketch out as some kind of logic of decentralization that started as a critique of Stalinism, or critique of Communist Party as merging with the state, right? That was a Yugoslav critique through self-management, that one needs to actually empower the workers. What happened was that this was just a partially true, or in some cases, in some factories, it worked. In many cases, the workers delegated their political power to directors. So to the directors of factories, to the technocrats, you would call, and then you would have a new balance of power between bureaucrats and technocrats. So this is one partial answer to the economic crisis. You would have a stronger or more intensive exploitation, and paradoxically less power in many cases for the workers. And on the other side, you would have a process that actually empowered republics. So it wouldn't be, the federation wouldn't be as strong, because it was seen as a centralizing agency, as dictatorship of the Communist Party and so on. But it would be kind of this more blind, I'd say, faith in a kind of market socialism. Market mechanisms will manage, but actually they were willed, and let's say, who benefited from this market socialism was the richest parts of the federation. So, of course, the North, so to speak, you have this dynamic between North and South that we know also from European Union. This was happening in Yugoslavia as well, and was guiding this nationalist and liberalist elements and ideologies together. So you have at the end of 60s, 70s, this is what Marta just mentioned with 68, you have students and workers that are like, there are wild strikes, there are many strikes, but there are also huge protests that are criticizing like kind of this red bourgeoisie, the market reforms, the unemployment. Many people also pushed as guinea pigs of the neoliberal reforms, you would say, in the whole European community. So Gastarbeiters are the flexible labor force that becomes much later on, the norm of today of everyone. So those that are not employed for regular contracts, but are in precarious work contracts or for 5 years or few years, whatever. So you have this dynamic that kind of springs from 60s, 70s. And then in the 80s, I would say you have replay of it. You don't have anymore the kind of strength of like old partisan generation of Tito that at the point in the 70s, like made a pretty clear political repression against the revolutionary left, but also against some right-wing tendencies. So there was this kind of what we call the certain purges, or people were also imprisoned in the early 70s or couldn't teach in universities or do films. But you would have in the 80s basically political vacuum. You not that you don't have Tito, you have also like the whole generation of carrierists that come into power in republics and through different apparatus in the 70s and early 80s. So you have that complex dynamic between a kind of political reformation of party, which is kind of called League of Communists, which takes on very opportunistic careerist cadres on one side and puts the left or revolutionary, which could renovate the socialist project or Yugoslav project, takes it out of the picture. So this is the political side. And the economic side, this is the reality. The Yugoslav economy, because of the market reform, gets more and more integrated in the global market. So you have commercial banks, you have debt, so external debt that is rising, and you have austerity reforms in the early 80s. So you have a very strong political and economic dynamic that wheels, the nationalists to powers everywhere. And you have, this is the interesting part of it, some kind of what I would call socialist, democratic civil society in a lot of places in the 80s across Yugoslavia, which in 87, 88 gets nationalized. So you have the question of language, you have the question of the miners that are striking in Kosovo, and all the parties, intellectuals, they're actually translating the class issues into the national context or into the national terms. So you have this culturalization, and but you have very different topics here. But yeah, just to give one side of the answer to it, to the rise of nationalism.
And thank you. I mean, this is extremely, I know, a question that maybe needs a whole hour for itself, or if not more. But thank you for this really attempt to really wrap it up so shortly.
If I can add just something to this question, is
ahead.
that actually when I listen to Gal now, is really interesting. I mean, in the film about which uses the archive footage of mass performances in Slats, actually you can see many of these actually influences in just by observing the surface of things, because this is what this film does, observing the surface of mass performances and these changes of and influences that Yugoslavia have, like retraditionalization of society in the 80s, then nationalism rising at the end of the 80s. I mean, all these things and this kind of clashes, also economic, influence of capital, of the Western capitalism, you can also see in the slides. Of course, with a historical distance now, but it's really interesting how many of these ideas that Gal mentioned, they are visible actually in these historical materials.
Yeah, thanks for the addition. I will break the time a bit. We'll just go a few minutes over time so we can get this last question, because it is interesting. It refers to you, Marta, but of course, Gal, also go ahead. Let's just keep it brief. It's since you have been working on the aestheticization of the propaganda, I find it interesting to mention that the avant-garde music band Laibach was censored and banned in socialist Yugoslavia, if I'm not wrong. I don't want to enter into the discourse of Laibach being controversial for many today, but maybe you have your own understanding of this, considering that they also received the status of dissident back in the days. Maybe off topic, but still something to discuss to understand the meaning of propaganda in these political terms in this context. So I guess both of you can refer a bit to this and then we can wrap it up.
I usually like to kind of evacuate the concept of propaganda from the discussion of the previous film, just because I don't see it as a very constructive concept. Even we can, also analyze the film from this perspective. But for me, it's more like, because I use archive footage, I don't use archive footage to illustrate things, but in a way to perform ideas and to put certain, people, practices, choreography, social dramas into relations through editing, of course. But it's not this kind of meta critique about the media footage. And I didn't actually. I wanted to kind of. I wanted to say, okay, in my research, in my work, let's do not observe things and these materials from a perspective of propaganda, because not all of them were propaganda. These were like social practices and state practices in the socialist Yugoslavia. Maybe they look like propaganda to us today, but because they're images, which we don't know so well. I also remember one comment from a film theorist who said, like, these images of the sleds, youth day celebrations, youth work actions, and so on, they were amazing, powerful, and so on. But this, at the end, like these counter demonstrations, it's boring because we know them. But it's not about this exotization, because I wanted also to show how images, at the end, in the beginning of 2000 or end of 90s, we share images. Our experience of these burned cars during the demonstrations, which also happened in Paris, in the 2000. But also in Belgrade. And in a way, we are all entering this transition that Gal mentioned in our region, like towards neoliberal capitalism. But regarding Laibach, of course, there were artists and filmmakers and musicians and so on who were banned at some point. They first had their own practice. I made a specific separate video installation dealing with this super interesting intervention by Laibach, which is related to the Youth Day celebration. And it's about Youth Day celebration of 1987, so end of 80s, when Laibach or Neue Slowenische Kunst, they proposed a poster for at the open call for the poster for which would be used as a poster for Youth Day celebration. And what they proposed was actually Nazi propaganda from 1936. Just they changed the symbol. They put a star instead of the swastika, and actually this poster won the open call. And then some from at the Workers' Council, one of the workers recognized this, and it was a huge scandal. And then it was a huge also discussion because the work that I did, which is not this film, but after this film, is also about the public discussion about this artistic intervention. Because how actually there was even, I was surprised that there is more discussion than today, like kind of debate. What do artists want to say? Do they want to say that socialist Yugoslavia is the same as Nazi Germany? Mentioning and putting these things together in public sphere back then, in the socialist public sphere, it's a very significant thing. So I think it was, the artists made their point, and definitely also criticized the regime, and we had this public debate. But maybe also Gal can say a bit more about that.
I wanted to ask for also some last remarks from you, Gal.
Just very shortly, I actually, when you think about the avant-garde legacy or the start of avant-garde art, you don't have a very strong juxtaposition to propaganda. So propaganda used to have a very positive connotation. When Eisenstein and Werther were making films, they wanted to change the world. They wanted to transform it. They wanted to influence the audiences in a very new way. So like, montaging, putting together, editing, using different techniques that would not be just imitating the reality. So kind of already experimenting with transhuman forms. So not to have men and women, but men and women with the movie camera. So kind of with the cinematic apparatus. So it was really, in this sense, propagating the new vision of the world. You can have this and try to kind of differentiate it from the state propaganda, or like what kind of comes as a much more static notion of propaganda or something. Ooh, this is just like indoctrination and stuff. Yeah, as if something doesn't indoctrinate us today. It's like being in the dispositive of the marketing and social media all the time. It's much stronger propagandistic tool than what socialist countries had at their disposal. So that's like my general comment, and my like more critical comment on the Laibach, even though definitely the beginnings are quite revolutionary and interesting in terms of also like disrupting certain notion of art, what is the role of artists, and so on. The more problematic, and this is the very naming. So, neue slowenische Kunst. Why neue slowenische Kunst? Why not neue jugoslawische Kunst? New Yugoslav art. So there is this kind of, like maybe at the beginning, some kind of tacit move from the left side to kind of also embrace the new national project. Which is like independent Slovenia, even though this is not inscribed in their artistic project. I think the level of naming is important. So in this sense, like what Inge Arm says, one theorist, it's retro avant-garde. It is not really neo-avant-garde anymore, but it uses some avant-garde mechanisms to provoke, to do this kind of interventions. At the same time, it doesn't believe anymore in avant-garde project. So you can say that the creation of a new country is avant-gardist, or you can say also it's very Stalinist. These are the open questions.
I guess we'll have to leave with these thoughts now, because I will really have to close this edition today. But thank you both really so much. We just scratched just a little bit on these huge topics, but still, I think it's enough to spark the curiosity for a further, for going deeper into your work for our audience. So now at the very end, I'm happy to share with you our next events. I will pass the word to my colleague Like Pfluger, who will moderate the next Disruptive Friday to tell us what the edition will be about. So thanks a lot from me. We will also show the trailer after Like's introduction. And see you all in 2 weeks again.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. So my name is Like, and I will just briefly share a bit about what we're going to have in our next Disruptive Fridays. So this next edition is going to take place in 2 weeks on the 30th of April. And there we're going to be discussing tips, tricks, and experiences for hosting online conferences. So something we've all been dealing with a lot in the past year. And we will have with us 3 amazing women that have been involved in some of the best conferences that I enjoyed last year as well. So we will have Sarah Rona of the Carpentries, and she was part of the organizing team of the CSV Conf, which is a community conference for data makers. We will have Maya Durlik, who is an organizer of community building events in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. For example, the Megaphone conference she worked on last year. And also we will have Anna Kuliberda, and she gives coaching support also on event organizing to activists and NGOs. And she worked last year as well on Megaphone, but also on the Personal Democracy Forum. So yeah, we hope we can learn a lot from them. And we hope to see you back in 2 weeks. And also from my side, many thanks to all of you for today's amazing edition.
Malko prema meni. Ja može noga. Bravo. Još ćemo jednom da ustanemo pa da... Dobro. I namestit ćemo. Hoćemo još jednom da se namestimo.
Skoknula sam. Šta da počnem?
Kako ste postali partizanka?